gosh, this is like so. Alright, so the next thing we're going to be going over is how, whenever you're doing an interp, how do you go from the book or your movie, play, how do you go from the scenes into your script? So how do you condense something like a 400-page book into a 10-minute speech? Because it is pretty daunting, and it is a lot of work. So I'm going to give you a lot of the tools that are available to us, because the NCFCA does have a lot of ways that we can condense speeches, ways that we can condense the characters. But before I get into that, does anybody know what you should do first? Whenever you choose your book, whenever you choose what you want to do, what do you do before you write your script? Does anybody, Eliana?
Read it.
Yeah, you should probably read it. Okay. So after you read the book, what should you probably do before you write your script? What do you think?
Look at the ballot.
Yeah, that's important. That's probably not the first thing before you write your script. The first thing you should do is come up with an outline, all right? Because it's going to be impossible for you to write a story unless you can have an outline of how it's going to go. For example, has anybody picked out a book already for what they want to do their open on? Yeah? Eliana, what's yours going to be on?
Oh my gosh, wait, what's it called?
LJ, do you have
Think about a little
Robin
bit.
Hood. I'm doing Robin.
Robin Hood? Okay, so are you doing it straight from the play or a book or?
I'm doing a book that was written by, it's one of the lesser known books, one of the lesser known.
Okay, so if I was going to do something like Robin Hood, I don't know how many pages that book is, but it's probably a good sized book. I couldn't just give the judge the whole book, right? I can't just go up there and just act it out. So what you want to first do before you even get into writing your script, what you're going to perform for your judges, is you need to come up with an outline of how things are going to go. If you've ever done IEW, Excellence in Writing, like outline, stuff like that, I'm pretty sure most of y'all have, just because you're homeschooled. You know how to write an outline, so you know how to have, you know, your setting, you know, your plot, your hook, all that, climax, and the resolution at the end. You know how a narrative story should go. So I want you to first come up with an outline, and after that, that's what I'm going to kind of mainly talk about today. I'm going to show you how do you take the scenes in your book, cut them down to a script, cut it even more, and make it 10 minutes. Because let me tell you, the first time I did an open, I started out with a 20-page script. Now, if you've done an intro before, that's way too long. Your script should be like 5 pages. So I had to cut out 15 pages of my script, and that's pretty daunting. That's a lot of stuff to do. So I'm going to show you the best ways and the easiest ways for you to cut it down. How do you choose the scenes that matter? What should you be doing? So the first thing that you should know when you're writing your script is line reassignment. Alright, so what this means is that there are rules in the NCFCA where you can reassign lines in your speech. So what's a well-known book? Anne of Green Gables. Okay, there's a lot of characters in Anne of Green Gables, and ideally in an interp, if maybe Grace was, oh, she did do that. Well, if Grace is going to do it again or something, she cannot play every single character in that book. Could you play every single character? No, you cannot. There's way too many, right? You should have like 3, maybe 4. You're pushing it after 4. All right, you have to be really good to be able to play all those characters, have that good acting. So how do you condense a script? Because sometimes, let's say for Anne of Green Gables, that's a big book, right? So if I wanted to tell the story about how she gets adopted, and I don't know, what's another thing? What could my plot be?
So like my plot was I basically told the story of her and Gilbert because she hated this boy Gilbert at her school, but then in the end they fell in love.
Right.
So there were a lot of stories going on in the book, but that's the one that I chose.
Okay, the story of Gilbert, if you look at Anne of Green Gables, it's not like the first part of the book is just the story of her and Gilbert. No, it's spread out throughout the entire book. So how are you going to go in and make it so that you only have lines for maybe Anne, maybe maybe Matthew and I forgot her name, and Marilla, and then Gilbert, and maybe that's it. But how do you assign lines? So let's see. Here's an example of line reassignment. Let's say, so I chose that I wanted the character Diana. Let's say I wanted Diana to play a central theme in my story. It doesn't really matter if you don't know who Diana is, just imagine her as a character. So here's the original selection of the book, and here's how it goes. It says, "Of course, you must be Elaine, Anne," said Diana. "I could never have the courage to float down there." "Nor I," said Ruby Gillis, with a shiver. "I don't mind floating down there when there's 2 or 3 of us in the flat and we can sit up. It's fun then, but to lie down and pretend I was dead, I just couldn't. I'd die of fright." All right, so that is kind of a conversation between Diana and Ruby Gillis. But Ruby Gillis isn't really a huge part of the story, and she's probably not going to be worth putting into my interp, because I just want to have Diana there because she's a little bit more central themed, right? So, something that you're allowed to do is I can take Ruby Gillis's line about how she doesn't mind floating down there if there's 2 or 3, but she just couldn't because she would die of fright. That part, I can give that line to Diana. So instead of, like in the book, Ruby Gillis performing that line, in my interp speech, Diana would perform that line. So you're kind of taking an already existing book and story and kind of, with that book, making your own story. A perfect example of this is in my duo last year, I Am Sam. There were a couple characters that, if you watch the movie, they're pretty, like, they matter to the script, but I can't perform a 2-hour movie, right, in my duo. So what I had to do is we had to get rid of characters, but then when I was getting rid of those characters, I saw, oh my goodness, I like a lot of their lines. For example, there was one character where they said a really great line that says, "Don't worry, you are enough." And that was a central theme in our speech, and we wanted that line. So we took that line, and we gave it to somebody else. We gave it to somebody that we felt like was important in our story, something that mattered to go along with the story. So the first thing you can do when you're writing your script, while you're getting rid of characters, reassign lines to the people that matter. If somebody should say a line and they're not saying that line, doesn't matter, you're allowed to give them that line. So now the next thing that you have to be able to do is pronoun substitution. All right, substitution, pronoun substitution. So what this means is, if there's a character in a book, I'm trying to think of an example. Okay, this happened to me a couple years ago. In the book I chose, there was a bunch of lines that were given by a girl that were talking about one of her friends that was a girl. But I liked the line because it was important to my story. Now what you're allowed to do is you can substitute a pronoun if you need to add it to your story. So for example, if I have an area where it says, well, she and I went to the park together, and so I would love it if, I don't know, you would invite her to the party, something like that. But she and her were referencing, in my story, I wanted to reference a guy because I wanted to add it to my kind of story. Then I can substitute those pronouns, and I can take away the she and replace it with he. Stuff like or she or I can make it possessive. So, for example, there are sometimes lines that are given that are talking about other people, but I wanted to talk about the character, like about myself, and so you can replace it with I, or here. So here's an example. If there was a line that says, "What on earth put such a notion into your head?" And I wanted to have like a little narrator area where Anne was talking about herself in Anne of Green Gables. I could say, "What on earth put such a notion into my head?" So, for example, if I had a place in my story where my character was talking to itself, I could give them that line, and I could substitute the pronoun so it makes sense in the story. And a lot of people actually don't know you can do this. I think it's kind of because you feel like you're changing the book. And you can't change, there isn't to extent how much you can change like lines in the thing. You can't take sentences and like create a word or something like that. But the NCSC does allow that you make certain changes so that you can fit it into your story, because if you're doing maybe a 2-hour play, you have to cut it out to 10 minutes. They understand you're going to have to make some changes in order to have a well thought out speech. All right, so you have pronoun substitution. Then you have, that's long, verb tense and subject verb agreement alterations. I'm just going to put verb alterations. So, verb alterations, here's an example. If I wanted to change something to past tense or to present tense, an example is in the original selection, if it said, "Were we really there half an hour?" If I wanted to say that it was just me that was there, I could say, "Was I really there half an hour?" Or something like, but we were only in fun. I could say, but I was only in fun. So I can change the verb tense about that. I don't really use that a whole lot unless you want to change something like you're talking about the past. Sometimes if you're reading a book, they'll do foreshadowing, or they'll also do things where they're referencing something that happened a while ago. And if you want to fit it into your story, what you can do is you can alter the tense of the verb. So if you want to talk about how something's happening right now, you're also able to change the line. So these are just all things important to know whenever you're writing your script. Sometimes you don't have to throw out a line. Sometimes you can just give it to somebody else or change it up a little bit because that is allowed. All right. This next one is probably my favorite one. I think it's the most important, and it is word repetition. All right, word repetition. So what this means is if there is a word in your script, like somebody's name, and you wanted to provide emphasis for a scene. So if I was in my scene, I was calling out Sam, something like that. I was calling for somebody to come. Then, and in the script, it only said, Sam, come over here. I can repeat the word Sam, and I can even repeat whole lines, all right? So, for example, my duo last year, the central thing was, are you enough? Stuff like that, like I am enough. That was our mantra, that was our theme, our thesis. But in our script, in the actual screenplay, they only ever said you are enough like once by somebody. And we wanted to repeat it throughout the speech because we wanted to remind the judges that, this is our mantra, this is kind of the whole idea, what's important about our speech. So you can repeat that line or a word in your script. So we repeated you are enough like 3 or 4 times throughout our script. Even though in the actual script it only said it once, you're allowed to repeat a line and give it to another character, or repeat a line and put it somewhere else. Even if in the actual book they say that line later in the story, you can say it at the very beginning. That's what we did. They didn't say you are enough till like the very end, and we said it at the very beginning, in our very beginning intro. Just kind of to provide some more emphasis to a word. I think it's probably, if you're having a conversation with somebody, maybe in your scene, somebody's having an argument, they can repeat something if something they feel like it adds. If it adds to the script, you're allowed to repeat a line or a word. You're allowed to do that. All right. Number 5 is line. All right, line and scene rearrangement. So, you are allowed to rearrange scenes. If there is a scene that you like that is at the end of the book or something, and you think it could be good at the beginning for whatever reason, you can move the scene. All right, everything is kind of flexible, so you're sticking to what the book says or what the movie says or the play, but you can move it around. You can have the scene in different areas of your speech, because, like I said, when you're cutting a really big book into a 10-minute speech, sometimes you have to, according to your outline or whatever story you choose to go along with, you have to realign or rearrange some of the scenes or some of the lines. So, as an example, oh no, so they lost connection. Okay, all right, so an example would be, so Grace, whenever you're doing Anne of Green Gables and you're doing the scene with Gilbert, you kind of skipped along to the scene where they're floating across the lake, right? And then, what's an example of like a scene that you had to take from somewhere in the book?
Well, actually, I can't remember for that one, but a better example is right now I'm cutting a duo that I'm doing with my brother.
Okay.
And it's really, really long, and so
Yeah.
we're having to take, I'm having to take certain lines from certain scenes and moving them to other scenes. Or I moved one scene that is at the very end and moved it up to the middle. So different things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so after, you write your outline, right, for your speech, sometimes you're going to realize that in order for your speech to make sense, you need to have an order of events. And sometimes the order of the events in the actual book that you're doing isn't the same as the story that you want to portray in your speech. So you can rearrange the lines or the scenes. You're allowed to do that. All of these things are definitely going to help you. If you want to have a good story, a good speech, you always are going to have to end up rearranging scenes or lines. If you, for example, if there's a conversation and you wanted some line to be said at the beginning of it or somewhere else other than where the book says the line is, you're allowed to move it so the conversation goes the way that you want it to go in your actual speech. So here's another example of it is if, here's a good example, this is useful. In the original selection of Anne of Green Gables, it says, "For pity's sake, hold your tongue," said Marilla. "You talk entirely too much for a little girl." "Can you wash the dishes right?" asked Marilla distrustfully. So those are two separate lines that Marilla has in one scene. Now, sometimes when you're cutting your book, you realize you need to get rid of lines because it's too long. How do I make these two sentences fit into one? How do I do that? So what they did is they took the beginning, "For pity's sake," which was in the first line, and at the end, Marilla says, "Can you wash the dishes right?" They combined it. So Marilla has these two different lines, and instead of saying that whole thing, because that's kind of long, especially when you have a 10-minute speech, they rearranged it to say, "For pity's sake, can you wash the dishes right?" You see how that kind of changes it up a little bit and how it made it a little bit shorter? So you can kind of put lines together like that. So if in the beginning of the book, in the duo that we did, the little girl that Sophia was playing, so the line "you are enough," it's kind of solo by itself, says "you are enough," but we wanted to make it so the little girl was telling her dad that, and so we added from another line that said, like, "Listen to me, Daddy, you are enough." Those aren't from the same line in the actual script if you look at it, but we combined it, we rearranged the lines to kind of make it fit our story. So you have a lot more flexibility than you think when it comes to writing your script, and you can combine a lot of stuff. Here's a great example. This is a really long paragraph. It says, "The 5:30 train has been in and gone half an hour ago," answered the brisk official. "But there was a passenger dropped off for you, a little girl. She's sitting out there on the shingles. I asked her to go into the ladies' waiting room, but she informed me gravely that she preferred to stay outside. There was more scope for imagination," she said. She's a case, I should say. So that's kind of long. And if you want to just get the point across in one simple line, they literally took that whole thing and rearranged the lines to say, "The train dropped off a little case." That's it. Just referring to Anne, the train dropped off a little case, because whenever you get down to cutting your speech, you don't have time to go into detail, and you have to realize that, you know what, I'm going to just have to take little parts and make it a simple line instead of this whole paragraph that's really just explaining this one simple thing. So that's also very important when you're having to rearrange your lines, when you're dealing with a script. Does anybody have an example like they came across for this, like in their book? Who all is doing an interp here? There you go. All right, so most everybody. Yeah, so when you're rearranging your lines, I don't know if nobody has questions about that, anything like how that works. Okay, great. All right. Next one. This is not as important to me, but you can definitely do it. All right, so narration to dialogue. So, oh my gosh. I don't know if I spelled that right, but you know what it means. All right, so translation from narration into like a monologue or a dialogue. There are a lot of stories that have a narrator. So, I don't know, does Anne of Green Gables have a narrator in it?
I had a narrator, I think.
Probably, I don't know. But most stories are going to have a narrator, and sometimes the narrator says important stuff because they're explaining the story. Oftentimes, the narrator's lines are super crucial in order to help your judge kind of understand where the story is going. So, something that's really important oftentimes is giving those lines into one of your main characters. So there can be dialogue or a monologue. I did this my first year, the book Wonder. There's a lot of narration about what's going on, and I made a lot of it just a monologue. So kind of in his thoughts, I had the boy kind of talking to himself, and trying to like explain what's going on from his point of view. So instead of having a whole new character, a narrator, who's not even really a part of the story and doesn't really add a whole lot most of the time, I just gave those lines to the person, to the main character in my speech. So another example of not like, so instead of, so you can transform narration into a monologue, but also into dialogue. So here's an example of how you can do that. So here's a narrator talking. It says, Anne dropped on her knees and gazed out into the June morning. Her eyes glistened with delight. Oh, wasn't it beautiful? Wasn't it a lovely place? Suppose she wasn't really going to stay here. She would imagine she was. There was a scope for imagination here. So those weren't really lines in the original book. Those were just narration given by the narrator describing her thoughts and feelings. But in an interp, you're supposed to act out the characters, right? So here's what they did. They took that into a conversation between Anne and Diana. And here's what they did. It said, they had Anne say, oh, isn't it beautiful? And Diana said, isn't it a lovely place? Suppose you aren't really going to stay here. And then Anne said, I will imagine I am. There is a scope for imagination here. So they took the lines from a narrator and they made a conversation out of it between the two main characters they chose, Anne and Diana. Yes?
Can you do it the opposite way? Can you turn dialogue into narration?
Yeah.
Like it's just
You can do it the other way around if you want to. If the line actually was a conversation with Anne and Diana, you could turn it into narration or just to one person. If there's a whole conversation and you just wanted one person to say what happened, perfectly fine. You can rearrange that too. No, you can't add your own words. Right. Yeah, so you can only use the existing lines in order to rearrange and create and change. You can't add your own into it because then that would be like then it wouldn't be you wouldn't be using their work. Then now it's kind of your work. But you can kind of manipulate the book into fitting into what you want it to be. So you have a lot of flexibility. I know when I first kind of got into writing my intro, I was like, oh my goodness, this is like so much, right? How am I supposed to make this book into a 10-minute speech just using the lines that they gave you? You actually don't have to do that. There's a lot that is given to you in order to change things up, move lines around, only talk about the important things, and condense your speech tremendously. So, all right. And also, the other thing that you're able to do is an introduction. So in your interps, you are allowed to use 150 words to have an introduction. It can really be anywhere in your speech, right? It doesn't have to be, I don't know, it has to be used to introduce the piece of literature. So you could have at the very beginning where right when you start, you just pop into the introduction where you use your 150 words. These are your own words, so you are this is you writing this. But what a lot of people do is they'll kind of start out with the hook. So for our speech, it was really short. It was just the little girl telling her daddy that you are enough. And that was it, just to kind of introduce them to the mantra. Grace, how did you open your speech?
And a presentation.
Any of them, doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I usually use a scene. So like, oh yeah, because of Winn-Dixie, I did that one a few years ago. And I did the scene where she brings the dog that she found at the grocery store home to her dad. And so she's showing it to her dad. Her dad's freaking out, and then I went into the intro and then back into the speech. So that was like a
Yeah. So the way you use the introduction to your advantage is that you can put it like a little bit, it doesn't have to be at the very beginning of the speech, it can be a little bit after, but it does have to introduce the piece. So, but it's completely fine for you to come up and give a little snippet of a scene like what Grace did, so to kind of catch the audience's attention. Because oftentimes what happens is when you start out with a scene, you start out with kind of like showing your audience where you're going to go, giving the first kind of like setting of your story. That really kind of sets the scene for, yeah.
So I know last year, I know most are kind of talking about like opens or duos. Last year I did a biblical, and something that I wanted to do with my biblical was I wanted to return to the same piece 3 different times. But in biblical, the rule was you could only use the same piece twice because I wanted to like build it up, but I didn't want to just return to it twice. So I started out. My teaser was the piece, then I had my intro, then I had the piece again, so I kind of still was able to break it up, and then I returned to it at the end, which kind of allowed me to use it 3 different times, even though the intro was just like right after the teaser.
Right. So there's 2 things to do that I think you need to do with your introduction. Use the placement of the introduction to your advantage, because you're able to have a little bit, not at the very beginning. You can have something before it. But also, the second thing is what your introduction actually does is pretty crucial, because it's easy for you to just go up and say, here's my story, here's what it's about, I'm Anne of Green Gables, stuff like that. But that's not really very interesting. Your introduction is your only chance to have your own words to explain. So if you're doing a story like a book that is not very popular, it's a perfect time to kind of set the setting. Something that judges might not get from watching just the speech itself is in your introduction, you need to explain what's going on, what's happening. If there's something really interesting about your book that I don't know, something interesting you can talk about in the introduction. The introduction is the ideal time to talk about your mantra, your theme, what you want your judges to get out of it. Most people aren't so good that just from watching the speech, they'll understand exactly what to get out of it or what the thesis of the speech was. So the introduction is whenever you kind of introduce, here's what I want you to get out of the speech. Here's what I want you to think about as you're watching this. If you have a funny speech, sometimes it's hard to kind of see what you're taking out, like the impact of your speech. So you're going to tell them, hey, as you're going through this, think about how the significance of telling the truth, honesty. And we're going to explore how this is portrayed in the book Huckleberry Finn, something like that. And so the introduction is the perfect time to introduce your impact, introduce the setting of your speech if you don't have it. Also, you're required to give the piece. So you would say, no, I forgot how to do an intro, it's been so long. You would say something like, so please enjoy Anne of Green Gables by, I don't know who it's by Ellen, I don't know, etc. And if there's multiple authors, you would have to say that too. So yeah, that's how the kind of the introduction of your speech. Use that to your advantage, because you're allowed to put in your own words, 150 words. You're allowed to sing. There's 60 words of singing. If for whatever reason that added to your speech, I've never done it. I've seen people who did it, and I was like, wow, that was great. I didn't know that was going to fit, but it did. There's also, I've seen people that have, actually that's for platforms. But yeah, just use the introduction to your advantage. Be able to give context, introduce the characters, highlight the theme or the message. That's kind of just your ideal kind of way to use it. So does anybody have any questions just about picking out the lines from?
I know how to be annoying. But
No.
with your intro, in the Robin Hood book, they show what I'm going to use as a teaser, but then they have a little intro in and of itself in the book.
Yeah.
Can I use that in my intro and not count it as my 150 words?
Okay, so yeah, you could still use that, and it wouldn't be your actual intro. Your introduction is your own words. In fact, you don't even have to have an introduction other than you have to state your piece and who it's by and the author. But really, if, for example, I've seen some speeches like that where inside of the book they had a kind of an introduction that explained the message, it gave the context, it introduces the characters, then all you have to do is just say so-and-so and so by so-and-so and so, like that. So yeah, for your example, if you don't want to use the intro, you can, but also that doesn't count towards your 150 words, because that's not your own words. It's the author's words. Mm-hmm.
How do you let the audience know that they're not your words?
That they're not your words?
That they're not yours?
For example, his example. So, you'd have to distinguish. So if your introduction was given by a narrator, if there's a narrator of Robin Hood and he gives the introduction, then he would have to have a character. It couldn't be you talking. Something that kind of there needs to be some sort of distinction between you and the character that you're portraying.
Another
something
thing,
to add?
that you could do is, something people do in interrupts a lot is in between scenes, they put their head down and then put their head back up.
Right.
So if your introduction, I don't know where you put it, but if it's actually from the book, I would say it like it's, so like maybe the first thing you open with is with that introduction. So you say that introduction, and it's somebody else's words, then put your head down, say the title of the book, put your head back down. And then that kind of shows that that introduction is not your own words, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
It
for
is-
sure that
yeah.
too, but.
It is in the rules that you have to, your voice in the introduction cannot be the same as any of the characters. There has to be a distinction. And so the judge has to know in their heads that whenever you're giving your introduction, that is you speaking, because it's easy if you have multiple characters to be like, oh my goodness, I have this fourth character, who do I make it? Oh, I'll just be me, because that's not taken up. You can't do that, because you're, whenever I come up and I say, hello, my name is Marco Ruiz, I'll be your next speaker today, just let me know whenever you're ready. All of that, that's you talking. Your speech isn't you other than your introduction. It's like in a, I don't know, in a play, okay? And if you're in a play, in a musical, you have to get into your character, right? So the audience and the judges there has to be a clear distinction. So it's in the rules. You can't use like your own voice or something. I mean, I don't know.
In his situation, he would have to give a voice to that. If he's going to quote it from the introduction of the book, it has to be in character.
Yeah.
It can't be his
Yeah, so if you're using, so anytime you're doing anything with the book, it has to be in character. So even if you had a narrator, that's still in character, but that narrator has to have some mannerisms. They can't stand like you. They have to maybe be, maybe they can be sitting down. That's how you know that's a narrator. Or they can be, I've seen people, the way they know is they have like the narrator reading the book to the audience. So it's like every time the narrator is talking, they're holding the book, and they're turning the pages, stuff like that. Or I've seen people, every time they're a narrator, they were writing down what they were telling you, stuff like that. So there has to be a clear distinction between you and then your characters, or else the judge sometimes doesn't know, wait, who is talking right now? Is that their words? Because that really does affect a lot of especially when you're introducing your piece, you need to know when you're giving the introduction and when you're actually telling the story. Anybody else have other questions? Any input anybody has that they would recommend for any other people?
How soon should you introduce the title?
The title, I usually do at the end of my introduction. If your book is well known, I've seen people that were like, at the beginning of the introduction, they went, in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, we see this, and this happens, and this happened, and blah, 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 send the context. You can start it out if it's well known, so the judge knows, oh, this is the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, it'll be easier for them to follow. If you choose a book that's less popular, and you're going to have to explain it, you can bring it up at the beginning. What's important, though, is that the judge has to know when you're delivering the title and then when you're referencing it, because whenever you say, today, so please enjoy Anne of Green Gables by so-and-so, that's when they know, okay, that is their title and that's the author, because there's a part in the ballot that they have to write down the title of the book. So if I'm referencing it, I don't want to say, in blah, blah, blah's book, this and this and this. The judge is going to be like, oh, wait, I didn't catch that. Do I need to write that down? Was that the only time he's going to give me the title? So be clear when you're giving the title. I don't know if there's like there's not really a specific time you should present your title. It needs to be in the introduction or somewhere. The only requirement in your introduction is that you give your title and your author. That's your only requirement. Anything outside of that is extra that you want to put into it. But at the bare minimum, you just have to have it in there somewhere. Anybody else have any sort of input, something, tips when you're writing it? Well, that is all I have for you today. So, those are the tools that you're able to use when you're cutting your script. Also, the speech cores are here to help you if you have any questions. I know if it's your first time, it's hard to kind of get your mind to grasp around what you're supposed to do. So yeah, me, Grace, Hannah, Evan, who else? Sophia. Is that it?
That's it.
Yeah, those people, feel free to talk to them. especially if you have any questions, if you only know Eden, talk to Eden. She'll direct you somewhere, or she'll answer a question. Yeah, we're here to help you because we've done it before, and so we know exactly how to do it again. And then also, watch an open or a speech or an interp online. If you look up NCFCA Open Interpretation, NCFCA Interp, there are videos of people doing it. I'm visual, so that really helps me when I see what other people do. I'm like, oh, that's how they do it. That's how they give their speech. If you look up any type of event from the NCFCA, there'll be videos of it. Make sure you put NCFCA though, because some other leagues
And now
might not be as.
Now they have like a YouTube channel with all the national champions over the
Yeah.
past few years. Those are the best to watch because
The people that were first place in the nation,
Yeah.
you can see what they did.
watch
Um,
Maddie Hambrick's Open because that's the best Open that's ever.
Yeah. So watch somebody else do it. That's definitely the best way to do it. Your homework, all right, assignments. So number one, you need to cut your selected scenes using the tools that I just explained. So all these tools, you need to start cutting your speech. So I know a recent assignment was to pick a book and to start thinking about a rough draft, like outline, something like that. Start cutting the scenes. So start figuring out how am I going to reassign lines, what characters am I going to use. That's kind of crucial because that determines everything else.
Can you write that on the board?
Yeah.
Outline.
So number one, what did I just say?
Cut your
Oh, yeah, cut speech. Cut your speech. So cut your speech. So start cutting out the scenes. Start making your speech into 10 minutes. You're gonna end up with like 20 pages, 15 pages. You're gonna have a lot of pages of script when you first start, and that's okay. That's where you start. That's the place to start. And then you just start cutting from there. You start reassigning lines. You start taking away lines, altering lines. That's where you go from there. And second, you're going to review the complete and official rules of your event to make sure that you're adhering to it. So this is important, especially because the rules change every year. So don't think just because you've done it before you know what you need to do. There are rules for a lot of stuff. What's something you get caught on?
like especially with script submission stuff.
Script submission, yeah.
Just making sure that your script is formatted correctly and making sure that you quote the book. Well, besides the few little alterations you can make sure you don't add anything or misquote something that you can't misquote. I've done that before.
Mm-hmm.
For biblical, I know this year there's you have to use a certain amount of words in your biblical passage,
Yeah.
which wasn't last year.
Mhm.
That's a new rule this
Yeah,
year.
so regardless of whether or not you're doing interp, you should always be checking the rules because they do change, and sometimes they add stuff that what's your advantage? Like, instead of 105 topics for apologetics, there's 80, which is a lot more manageable. So yeah, those are your two things to do. So cut your speech, doesn't matter if it's 20 pages, 30, doesn't matter, and then review the rules for whatever category you're doing. And with that, I'm letting you guys go a little early today, so